The room congealed into thick, transparent jelly of time before I could lift my eyes from the plate. A sharp, solitary screech of a chair, a fork clattering loudly onto the parquet floor, and through this mundane noise, like a knife through fabric, burst a familiar voice, reeking of tobacco and the past century, the voice of my grandfather. "You have been receiving disability benefits for many years now." The phrase, cold and polished like a pebble, hung in the air. I felt all the faces, as if on command, turned towards me, forming a blind, stifling ring. A throbbing started in my temples, and I felt the heat rising from my neck to my cheeks, the air compressing, becoming thick and unfit for breathing, that special, oppressive silence descending, a silence that doesn't await an answer, but only demands a mute, animal reaction. I took one deep, saving breath, trying to find an anchor, and then, barely moving my lips, whispered into the space directed at my grandfather, "What do you mean?" Before we continue, I'm very curious. Which country are you from, dear listeners? Write in the comments where you're listening from. And now we continue. It was at that very moment, through the encroaching veil of confusion, that I noticed behind his stooped shoulder another man, a stranger, in a strict suit with the impassive face of an accountant. He was holding a closed folder the color of sodden earth. My parents, Linda and Mark, sat motionless, staring at their plates, avoiding my eyes with such diligence as if their lives depended on it. And before either of them could utter a word, the man opened the folder with a snap, and the rustle of papers sounded louder than any scream. I grew up in a house where silence was not an absence of sound, but a substance in its own right, spreading faster and penetrating deeper than any truth. My parents, Linda and Mark, liked everything to be neat, predictable, and controlled, like furniture arranged with a ruler. I understood early, almost instinctively, that the easiest way to preserve this fragile, lacquered world was to become smaller, quieter, more transparent, to turn into a faint shadow that was convenient to ignore. My younger sister Emma, sunny and noisy, never had to learn this science of self-abasement. Into every room she entered, she brought a whirlwind of life. She was the desired son, the heiress to all the light and attention. Her desires, spoken aloud, materialized as if by magic. When she merely stumbled, not yet feeling the weight of the fall, someone was already there to offer a shoulder. Dad, watching this, would say placidly, "She just needs a little more support." And that little added up into years, into mountains of gifts, and an ocean of indulgence. Support turned out to be the only resource in this house that I, it seemed, was never entitled to. I remember first feeling this imbalance, not in my soul, but physically, right in my bones. I was 12, standing in the kitchen, clutching a field trip permission slip in my sweaty fingers. The fee was $35. Mom, without looking up from the bills spread on the table, tossed out, without looking at me, "We can't afford extras this month." Her voice was even, final. But just minutes later, Emma burst into the kitchen, waving a bright flyer for dance lessons. And Mom smiled, that special, soft smile I only ever saw directed at her. "Of course, darling, we'll sign you up." The same week, the same bills, but different unspoken rules. By high school, this pattern didn't break. On the contrary, it deepened, carving a clearer boundary through our lives. When Emma's brand new laptop broke, Dad, without batting an eye, ordered her an even more modern replacement. When my own well-worn one finally died, he advised me with a sigh, "There are computers at the library. It's always free in the mornings." Emma prepared for exams with private tutors, while I received only dry reminders to work harder, more diligently, more. That's how our house was structured. 2 children, separated by an invisible wall, 2 parallel realities. One unspoken truth that everyone knew, but no one dared to voice. And then came the injury. I slipped on a wet tile floor during my part-time shift at the cafe. After that, something in my back broke for good, and I never moved with the same ease again. Every morning began with a quiet click and a dull ache. I learned to lift even light objects carefully, deliberately, shifting my weight from foot to foot. I religiously kept every receipt for every packet of medicine, every heating ointment, creating my own pathetic insurance fund, because I never knew when I'd have to buy them again, and I could only rely on myself. Once, caught on a momentary wave of naive hope, I showed Mom the first prescription for painkillers, thinking I'd see concern, sympathy in her eyes. But she just looked away and sighed wearily. You need to be tougher, Iris. You can't rely on anyone in this world. Rely only on yourself. That sentence, cold and honed, became the main rule, the principle by which I built my entire life. In college, the situation didn't just continue, it crystallized, acquiring the rigidity of an undeniable law. Emma attended a private school across town, expensive and prestigious, whose name Mom wove into conversations with outsiders for months, as if it were her personal achievement. I was struggling through studies at a local community college, working nights at a warehouse, endlessly shelving boxes under the dead light of fluorescent lamps. When the cost of my textbooks surpassed all reasonable limits, I quietly, almost furtively, dropped one of the key courses. When Emma's elective classes conflicted even slightly with her schedule, our parents, without a second thought, hired an expensive consultant to help her navigate the academic waters. The most vivid, searing memory from that time happened in our kitchen, that sanctuary of domesticity which had become my field of Cold War. I had just returned from an exhausting shift. My back was on fire, as if someone had stuck a red-hot knife between my ribs and left it there. With my last strength, I placed the crumpled prescription on the countertop, and next to it, the almost empty bottle where 2 remaining pills rattled lonely at the bottom. Mom, her back to me, was calmly and focusedly seasoning chicken for dinner. The sound of my footsteps didn't make her turn around. "Mom, could you help me with this?" I exhaled, and my voice held not so much a request as a plea for a truce. She didn't stop chopping herbs. "You're stronger than this, Iris. Don't be dramatic," came her reply, even and polished like an artificial stone countertop. Next to her, the kitchen shone with new stainless steel appliances bought last spring, flawless, cold, untouched by any struggle. I stood frozen under the dim light of the chandelier, clutching the empty bottle that desperately rattled, beating out the rhythm of my defeat. And in that moment, it finally hit me, collapsing with the full weight of a ruthless truth. Effort meant absolutely nothing. Pain was not a valid argument. Need did not awaken compassion. In this house, there was only a hierarchy, unshakable and cruel. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just slowly nodded to myself in the emptiness and stuffed the rattling bottle deep into my bag. That day, I finally understood the place I occupied in this family. Returning to the dinner table, I realized with sudden clarity that the room had become much smaller than in my memories. The light from the lampshade was warm and soft, but that evening it held no warmth. My parents, Linda and Mark, presided at the epicenter, where they always sat, facing the relatives who were dearest to them. My younger sister Emma was leaning towards Mom, whispering something in her ear, and they both laughed a quiet, harmonious laugh. I watched the smooth curve of their shoulders, the ease of their breathing. It was that type of deep, innate comfort to whose threshold I was never invited. Grandfather sat at the opposite end of the table, like a solitary monument, the only person in the room not trying to seem normal that evening. His jaw was clenched so tight the knuckles of his fingers gripping the napkin turned white, and his gaze, dark and intent, relentlessly followed the contours of my face, as if searching for confirmation of a truth he might not have wanted to believe. The man behind him, still holding the ill-fated folder, had not been introduced, but I knew without it, he was not family. His posture was too straight, too drilled, his demeanor detached and official. I later learned he was an auditor hired by Grandfather, but at that moment, he was just another detail, another nail making my heart constrict and go numb. The dinner continued as if nothing had happened, as if Grandfather's words were just an unfortunate creak of the old parquet. Polite conversation resumed around the table, compliments flowed about the roasted chicken, and Emma, beaming, began talking about her next vacation in the Alps. My parents nodded with such proud absorption, as if they personally curated every step of her life, from her first word to planning the itineraries. I sat motionless, holding my hands on my knees, my fingers intertwined so tightly they turned white from the strain, just so they wouldn't betray my inner trembling. Grandfather didn't touch his food. His fork lay untouched next to the fine china plate. He just waited, and in his silence there was a formidable, relentless force. Then he repeated his phrase, uttering the same words he had hurled at me minutes before, but this time without challenge, almost resignedly. "You have been receiving disability benefits for many years now." He didn't raise his voice, speaking calmly, too calmly, letting each word fall into the silence with the weight of a lead ball. A deathly silence fell over the table again, even more ringing than before. My cousin glanced at me furtively with mute bewilderment, as if trying to discern traces of a crime in my features. Emma, however, looked merely irritated, as if this sudden interruption was a personal inconvenience, disrupting the usual flow of the evening's performance. Something inside me snapped. But it wasn't fear or a flash of anger. It was something heavier and colder. A slow, raw realization that everyone present in this room knew something about my life that I myself was unaware of. My breath caught, and I heard my own whisper again, escaping involuntarily, the only phrase that still made sense. "What do you mean?" Mom's fingers froze on the edge of the linen napkin. Dad stared at his plate with such intensity, as if trying to disappear into its porcelain reflection. But no one answered, not a single word. The auditor with the folder took a small but distinct step forward, and in that moment it finally dawned on me. Whatever was happening here, it was not a regrettable mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a calculated blow. I excused myself, rising from the table before anyone could utter the next sentence, and no one tried to stop me. That was the strangest, most deafening part of it all. One would think a daughter getting up from the big family table after such a monstrous accusation would provoke some reaction, an objection, a question, even feigned concern. But behind me followed only a muffled wave of resumed conversation, hurried and strained, the kind people use when desperately trying to pretend that nothing out of the ordinary has just happened. The hallway beyond the dining room was narrow and plunged into semi-darkness, sharply contrasting with the brightly lit dining room. Right by the door, as if on purpose, hung a large photograph in a gilded frame illuminated by a small sconce. My parents and Emma, captured in a moment of carefree happiness during one of their vacations. I was not in the photograph. I stood before it for a few moments, letting the cool air cool my burning skin. My heart wasn't pounding in panic. It beat slowly and measuredly, as if it had finally stopped fluttering in perpetual fear of this family and its laws. I slung the strap of my old canvas bag, the constant companion of all these years, over my shoulder. Inside lay unassuming but relentless testaments to my reality, neatly stacked receipts for medication copays, a jar with 2 remaining pills, and a small, worn-out notebook where I meticulously recorded every treatment-related expense. I used to think this pedantry was just a way to take responsibility for my own life. Now these humble sheets had turned into irrefutable evidence of a life built without a single cent of the support I had, allegedly, been receiving all these years. I slipped into the bathroom, closing the door behind me, and for a moment leaned against the solid wood panel, as if cutting myself off from the absurd world left in the dining room. The mirror above the sink, covered with a light haze of dust, caught the blurred, uncertain light of the chandelier, fracturing my reflection into pale fragments. I automatically pressed my index and middle fingers to the bridge of my nose. This gesture had become my reflex, the only pressure release valve when something much heavier and duller than ordinary anger settled in my chest. My reflection in the matte glass looked detachedly calm, too calm, as if behind my features there was not a person, but a void waiting for further instructions. I sank onto the closed toilet lid, feeling the cold of the porcelain even through the fabric of my dress, and opened my old notebook. Every page, scrawled with crooked lines, was filled to the brim, Dates, amounts, notes made with a cheap ballpoint pen that left peculiar ink blots on the cheap paper. Rent, prescription medications, meager groceries, bus fare, fees at the municipal clinic. I ran my thumb over the worn corner of one of the pages, and memory resurrected those endless nights when I lay awake, calculating whether skipping a meal would stretch my painkiller supply for a few more days. I had always, until the very last moment, convinced myself that this humiliating arithmetic was temporary. I never could have imagined that my parents had been keeping their own parallel ledger all this time, using the very money that was legally meant to help me survive. I took out my phone. The screen remained black and silent. No new messages, no missed calls, not a single question from Linda or Mark about where I had gone or if I was okay. It was so typical it didn't even hurt. I opened the banking app. My balance stood in all its nakedness, small, predictable, painfully honest. I scrolled through the transaction history for the past year, then further back. Nothing unusual. No mysterious deposits, no payments that didn't belong to me. Of course, there was no trace of the very disability benefits Grandfather had so confidently declared. My pulse didn't quicken. Instead, a strange, chilling clarity settled inside me, the kind that makes the world around you quiet and the contours of things unbearably sharp. Without a shadow of a doubt, I typed an email to the benefits office, and my fingers slid across the screen without the slightest hesitation. Hello, I am writing to request a complete history of disability payments issued in my name. Please confirm all addresses listed in the file. Thank you. No drama, no lengthy explanations, just a direct question that by right should have belonged to me for the past 10 years. Returning to the dining room, I didn't go back to my seat. I remained standing in the doorway, becoming a silent observer of this pathetic play. Grandfather still sat at his post, isolated from everyone with his arms crossed. The auditor, whom I later learned was named Stevens, maintained his stoic pose, and his folder remained tantalizingly closed. My parents were pretending with strained ease that absolutely nothing had happened. Emma, absorbed in her phone, was scrolling through a social media feed, a slight boredom etched on her face. I could have charged into that breach, made a scene, demanded an answer. Why had they taken what didn't belong to them? Why had they condemned me to a life of constant financial strangulation while they renovated their kitchen and paid for Emma's travels? Why had they spent years implying to relatives that I simply refused to help myself? But confrontation, loud scandals, and theatrical gestures were their language, a language I neither knew how nor wanted to speak. Silence had always been the key to my survival within these walls. Now, perhaps, it was to become the architecture of my control over the situation. I slowly walked to my chair, took my simple wool coat from its back, and draped it over my shoulders. The movement was unhurried, almost ritualistic. Grandfather noticed my departure. His piercing gaze softened for a fraction of a second, something like approval or bitter understanding flickering in it, but he didn't utter a sound. He didn't need to stop me. He, unlike the others, had already understood that I wasn't running away in fear or humiliation. I was leaving to gather the shards of myself and build something new, something unbreakable from them. The air outside was cold, winter sharp, and so thin that every breath scratched my throat like icy dust. I walked to the end of the driveway without looking back, and the only sound breaking the silence was the insistent, dry crunch of gravel under the soles of my boots. The streetlights stood along the road like a mute guard, their light pouring onto the asphalt, casting ghostly, elongated shadows that seemed ancient as the night itself. I stopped under one of them, opened my old bag, and took out a small but dense stack of receipts. A whole chronicle of survival, without a single cent obtained dishonestly. And yet, all those payments that, according to Grandfather, I had allegedly been receiving. The wind, sharp and gusty, tried to tear the fragile sheets from my hands, making the corners of the paper flutter desperately. But I just clenched them tighter with my fingers, feeling the rough texture of the receipts under my fingertips. When I returned to my modest apartment in Seattle later that evening, the flickering hallway light greeted me, as always. I didn't turn it off, allowing that nervous blinking to fill the space. As if in a trance, I knelt and scattered my entire dossier across the worn floor. Piles of receipts, pale medical bills, official letters, my worn-out notebook. I sat cross-legged and silently watched as the old refrigerator hummed in time with my breathing, filling the room with its monotonous vibrational murmur. And then I got to work, began collecting, systematizing, categorizing, cross-referencing dates and amounts. I no longer needed to guess why my parents had done what they did. I needed only the bare, irrefutable facts. Facts know no doubt. Facts don't lie. Facts cannot love one child more than another. I opened a spreadsheet on my laptop and began filling the impassive cells with numbers, dates, medical diagnoses. I added a separate column for the estimated amount of disability benefits I should have been receiving. When I calculated the approximate monthly figure and multiplied it by 120 months, by a whole decade, I felt absolutely nothing. No flash of anger, no wave of shock, just the weight of the truth, cold and inexorable, like a block of ice sinking to the bottom. With each hour, the spreadsheet grew, turning into a quiet but formidable blueprint, a detailed map of a life lived without the assistance that was rightfully mine. Around midnight, an electronic notification chime cut through the silence. The benefits office had complied with my request, sending the payment archive. I shifted my gaze from the screen to the papers scattered around me on the floor and slowly exhaled. This time, I whispered into the empty, darkness-engulfed room, "I will not fix what they broke." When I drove up to my parents' house the next day, the driveway was already packed. Cars resembling imports were crowded along the curb, as if someone had decided to throw a grand party without waiting for the inconvenient truth to explode right in the center of this well-being. I froze for a moment at the edge of the path, letting the biting winter air envelop me from all sides. My breath rose into the frosty heights in thin, twisting tendrils to disappear soundlessly into the gray sky. That ephemerality seemed deeply symbolic to me at that moment. Entering inside, I found the dining room frozen in the same unnatural pose as the previous evening. The same warm, but now seemingly artificial, light streamed onto the polished surface of the long table. The same unspoken agreement hung between my parents. Linda and Mark presided in the center, like monarchs on a throne built from their own prosperity. But their posture was stiff. My younger sister Emma was nestled next to her mother, chin propped on her hand, still scrolling through her phone feed with indifference, as if the proceedings were a boring backdrop to her digital life. Grandfather maintained his position at the far end of the room, erect and unyielding as a rock, his sharp gaze darting between those present. The man introduced as Auditor Stevens was frozen behind him again, and that same folder was still tantalizingly closed. My appearance elicited no greetings, no glances. A perfectly ordinary situation grown habitual over long years. However, Stevens, catching my eye, gave a barely perceptible but conscious nod, a gesture of professional solidarity. Grandfather clenched his jaw, a movement that was a silent but distinct signal to all assembled. Today's conversation would not resemble yesterday's evasions and half-truths. "Let's begin," he said, and his voice sounded even, official, stripped of all the emotional overtones that usually warmed it. It was not an outburst of anger, but a cold, impersonal display of power I hadn't seen in him for many years. Mom fidgeted restlessly in her chair. "Dad, maybe not now?" Her voice trembled. "And Iris probably doesn't want—" He sharply raised his hand, and this gesture, like a knife, cut off her sentence. "This isn't about what Iris wants," Grandfather countered, and each word fell with the weight of a lead seal. "It's about what was taken from her." Mark, my father, cleared his throat nervously, trying to maintain a semblance of calm. "We didn't take anything," he declared, looking somewhere into the space between Grandfather and Stevens. "A simple misunderstanding occurred, nothing more." And then Stevens stepped forward. Without any preamble, without emotional preambles, he opened the folder. The rustle of turning pages, clean and dry, sounded more eloquent than any angry accusation. Inside lay neatly filed documents, sorted by year, covering the last decade. He extracted the first sheet, a printout of bank statements with a column of monthly payments going to my name, but with the recipient address matching my parents'. Then followed a second sheet from another year, the same scheme, the same deposits, the same recognizable signature of my mother in the receipt field. Stevens traced line after line with the tip of his pen. According to the documents, these payments were designated for the support of Iris's health condition. His voice was indifferent, like a newsreader announcing the weather. However, all deposits were redirected to this address, not to her place of actual residence. Linda's face turned as white as chalk. Emma's fingers froze on her smartphone screen. Father leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest with such force as if trying to shield himself from a physical blow. We used that money for the family's general needs, he muttered, and his voice held a note of uncertainty for the first time. What about the vacation in Europe? Stevens asked softly, but insistently. Or the capital renovation of the kitchen? Or the SUV purchased 5 years ago? Mom blinked unnaturally fast. We had expenses, she exclaimed, a hint of hysteria ringing in her voice. Emma's private school tuition wasn't cheap. The room seemed to shrink, pressing on my temples. I didn't say a word. There was no longer any need. Every figure, every date on those soulless pages was screaming for me, louder, clearer, and more relentlessly than I could ever have imagined. With polished, almost ceremonial calm, Stevens placed the final sheet on the polished tabletop. It lay there, silent and inexorable, drawing the final tally. 10 long years, monthly deposits turned into an astronomical sum, over $280,000. I watched the masks shift on my parents' faces. First, stony denial, followed by rapid, feverish calculation, the search for a loophole, and finally, emptiness, fragile and defenseless. It's the expression people get when the ground of their fabricated reality gives way and they are left alone with the bare, unvarnished truth that no longer belongs to them. Grandfather pushed his chair back with a sharp, deafening scrape. The sound echoed through the frozen dining room. He didn't take his heavy gaze off Linda and Mark. "Do you have anything to say?" His question this time didn't thunder, but landed coldly and flatly, like a verdict leaving no room for appeal. Mother's voice trembled, turning into a plaintive whisper. It seemed to us she didn't need it. She was always so independent. We all said she was irresponsible. Grandfather parried, and his words cut like steel. You sent her away without medication. You let her work through pain to update your kitchen. Father looked at me, and in his eyes, fear and something vaguely resembling shame darted like cornered animals. We were going to tell you everything, he exhaled. But Grandfather, he asked first. Silence fell in the room again, but this time of a different quality. Not awkward, but thick, all-consuming. Not bringing relief, but only tightening the noose of guilt tighter. I stood motionless, my hands folded loosely in front of me, my faithful canvas bag hanging at my side. I felt a strange weightlessness, not vindication, not triumph, but just a complete, absolute presence, here and now. Finally, in a moment that belonged only to me and wasn't based on anyone else's narrative, Stevens clicked the folder shut. The accounts associated with these deposits will be frozen pending investigation, he announced. Regarding restitution, we will contact Iris directly. Mother's breath escaped with a quiet, sharp sound, as if the last bubble of air had burst in her sinking world. Father's shoulders slumped hopelessly. Grandfather turned to me, and in his gaze, I read something resembling weary respect. You don't have to stay here, he said quietly but firmly. You owe them nothing. I nodded once, not to him, but to myself, affirming my own decision. I picked up my coat from the back of the abandoned chair. The fabric felt cool and painfully familiar to the touch. I put it on, slightly tightening the collar, as if preparing for a long journey. No goodbyes, no pompous final words, just the quiet, measured rustle of my footsteps accompanying my departure. Behind me, a real silence finally settled. Not one exploding with shouts, but one born from the bitter realization that the truth had already chosen its side, and nothing could change that. Grandfather drove in silence, his hands covered with a network of veins, gripping the wheel firmly and confidently, while the road stretched ahead in long, night-bound asphalt ribbons, disappearing into the velvety darkness. The streetlights, like falling stars, slid across the windshield, fracturing my pale reflection into momentary fragments. And I watched as each particle of me slipped away and disappeared irrevocably into the stream of light, as if I was finally shedding something heavy and alien that I had carried within me for too long. He didn't ask if I was okay, didn't fill the car's space with angry apologies or indignation. He simply allowed the silence to reign between us, that very healing silence which demands nothing and compels nothing. And it was an unfamiliar, almost too tender sensation, one my soul had grown unaccustomed to touching. Stopping at my building entrance, he left the engine running, and its steady hum became the sonic backdrop for his words. "They won't take another dollar, not a single cent," he said. And his voice wasn't angry, it was final, like a verdict not subject to appeal. I nodded, running my fingers over the rough canvas strap of my bag, inside which lay the folder Stevens had given me before leaving. Copies of all the documents where my name was printed where it belonged, but where my actual address was missing from every line, a silent but eloquent proof of how easily and systematically I had been erased from my own life. I got out and headed for the entrance door, and the light in the hallway, as always, was flickering upstairs. But that nervous trembling of the bulb didn't bother me anymore today. It was honest, imperfect, but my own. In my apartment, I placed the folder on the kitchen countertop, and the papers stirred slightly at the edges, catching the faint hum of the refrigerator, filling the room with life. And I remembered that other kitchen I grew up in, shining with polished appliances, flooded with bright but cold light, and the empty medicine bottle hidden deep in a bag. I stood now, breathing slowly, allowing the memories to flow freely, without the usual interference of a chest constricting in pain. And this time, the silence around me didn't feel oppressive and hostile. It was like air, fresh and thin, which I could finally breathe fully. I left the folder on the table all night, and it lay untouched, its weight unchanged, its edges sharp and clear in the soft light of the dawn. And nothing in it urged me to forgive or forget. It merely asked me, silently, to see things as they are, without embellishment and self-deception. Boundaries, I realized, are not loud. They are quiet, invisible places inside you where you stop allowing others to write your story. And if you have ever retreated from an imposed alien version of yourself, let this account be your reminder. You are permitted to choose the one truth that belongs to you by right, and to walk without looking back towards the life that finally fits you, and not someone else.